My name is Rachel Ainsley. I'm 36 years old, and 6 months after my father died, my own mother and her new husband sat across from me at a conference table and told me, with lawyers present, that I wasn't entitled to a cent of the $2 million my father had left me. What none of us knew, what none of them had bothered to check, was that my father, in the last clear-minded weeks of his life, had recorded something specific with his estate attorney, to be played only if exactly this kind of moment ever happened. Her silent revenge stories. If you've ever had someone who claimed to love you try to quietly take something that was never theirs, comment "I've been there" below. This one's for you. My father, Walter Ainsley, built a mid-sized commercial real estate firm from almost nothing, starting in his late 20s with a single small office building he'd bought with a loan he barely qualified for, and growing it, over 3 decades, into a company that managed properties across 4 states. He was not, by nature, a sentimental man. He was precise, methodical, and quietly generous in ways that rarely announced themselves, the kind of father who showed love primarily through consistency and provision rather than open affection, a trait I understood better as I got older, even when it left me, as a child, occasionally wishing for something warmer. I want to describe a little more about who my father actually was, because I think it matters for understanding why the events of this story unfolded the way they did. He grew up the son of a machinist in a small industrial town, one of 5 children in a household where money was tight enough that he'd started working part-time jobs by age 13, an experience that shaped, permanently, his particular relationship to financial security. He talked about those years rarely, and only ever briefly, but the specific caution and precision he brought to every financial decision throughout his adult life traced back, I always understood, to a childhood spent watching his own parents struggle with instability he was determined never to recreate for his own family. He met my mother in his late 20s, not long after he'd purchased that first small office building, and their early years together, based on the stories I've heard from both of them separately over the years, were genuinely happy ones, a young couple building something together, my father's business slowly expanding, my mother working as a schoolteacher until I was born, at which point she stayed home to raise me while my father's company continued to grow. I was their only child, a fact that made the eventual structure of his estate considerably simpler than it might otherwise have been, though, as this story demonstrates, simplicity on paper didn't translate into simplicity in practice. My mother, Diane, and my father had a marriage that, from my vantage point growing up, always seemed steady on the surface but somewhat hollow underneath, the specific kind of long partnership that persists more out of habit and shared logistics than genuine closeness. They divorced when I was 24, a separation that surprised almost no one who knew them well, though it complicated, in ways none of us fully anticipated at the time, exactly how my father's eventual estate would be structured and understood. I want to note, because it matters significantly for what follows, that my parents' divorce was finalized nearly a decade before my father's death, and that my mother had remarried in the years since, to a man named Roger Calloway, a financial consultant with a specific talent, I'd come to learn, for identifying opportunities in other people's uncertainty. The divorce itself, from what I understood at the time and learned in more detail later, had been relatively amicable as these things go, a fair, roughly even division of the marital assets they'd accumulated together, no significant disputes over property or finances, simply 2 people who'd grown apart over decades and decided, mutually, that continuing to share a life together no longer made sense for either of them. My father kept the business, which had always been structured, legally, as separate from their marital assets given how early he'd founded it, and my mother received a substantial settlement reflecting her contributions to their shared life and household over their nearly 3 decades of marriage. I mention this specific history because it became directly relevant, years later, to exactly the kind of arguments Roger would eventually attempt to construct. My father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer a little over a year before he died, a diagnosis that arrived, as it often does with this particular disease, later and more aggressively than any of us were prepared for. He was 68 at the time, still actively running significant parts of his company, still sharp and fully engaged in his own affairs in a way that made the diagnosis feel, initially, almost impossible to reconcile with the specific, precise man we all knew him to be. I want to describe, briefly, what that year looked like, because the choices my father made during it, quiet, deliberate choices, made largely without announcing them to the rest of the family, turned out to matter enormously for everything that followed. He underwent treatment initially, a combination of chemotherapy and a surgical attempt to address the tumor, but by the 7-month mark, his oncology team told him plainly that the disease had progressed beyond what further aggressive treatment could meaningfully address, and he made the decision, characteristically clear-eyed, to shift toward comfort-focused care rather than pursue further, likely futile interventions. I remember the specific conversation where he told me this decision, sitting across from me at his kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, laying out the oncologist's assessment in the same measured, business-like tone he might have used to describe a difficult quarterly earnings report. "I've looked at the numbers," he told me. "The additional treatment they're proposing has a small chance of buying a few more months, at a significant cost to how I'd actually get to spend those months. I'd rather have fewer months where I'm still myself than more months where I'm not." I didn't argue with him. I don't think I could have, even if I'd wanted to, given how clearly he'd already thought it through. During those final months, I became, in practical terms, his primary point of contact and support, coordinating his care, managing communication with his medical team, and spending increasing amounts of time simply sitting with him as his condition progressed. I moved much of my freelance graphic design work to a more flexible schedule during this period, specifically so I could be present for his appointments and, later, for the long afternoons when he mostly wanted quiet company rather than active conversation. Those months, difficult as they were, remained some of the most meaningful of my adult life, a stretch of time when the specific, undemonstrative closeness my father and I had always shared finally found room to express itself more openly than it ever had before. My mother, though divorced from him for nearly a decade by that point, remained in periodic contact throughout his illness, visits that struck me, even at the time, as carrying an undertone I couldn't quite name yet, something more attentive and solicitous than the relationship between them had displayed in years. I want to be fair and note that some of this attentiveness likely came from a genuine place. Divorced couples who share decades of history together often do maintain some real residual care for each other, even after the romantic relationship has fully ended, and I don't think it would have been unreasonable, on its own, for my mother to want to check in on an ex-husband facing a terminal diagnosis. What eventually distinguished her behavior from simple, residual care was something I'd only come to understand more fully in the months that followed. About 4 months before my father died, I began noticing a specific pattern that unsettled me without my fully understanding why at the time. My mother's visits, previously infrequent and somewhat perfunctory, had become noticeably more regular, often coinciding, I eventually realized, with periods when my father was more fatigued or medicated than usual, stretches when his usual sharpness was, understandably, somewhat dulled. I remember mentioning this observation, almost in passing, to a close friend of mine, Nadia, over coffee one afternoon, describing the pattern with the specific unease I hadn't yet fully articulated even to myself. Nadia, who'd gone through a similarly complicated situation with her own grandmother's estate years earlier, listened carefully and then asked me a question that stuck with me for weeks afterward. "Does it feel like they're visiting him, or does it feel like they're visiting his paperwork?" I didn't have a good answer for her in the moment, but the question itself crystallized something I'd been circling around without quite naming. Roger, my stepfather, began accompanying her on some of these visits as well, a development that struck me, from the very beginning, as strange, given that Roger and my father had never had a particularly warm relationship, the two men having met only a handful of times over the years since my parents' divorce. I remember the first time Roger showed up unannounced at one of these visits, ostensibly because he'd been in the area, a claim that struck me as implausible given that his office was nearly 40 minutes from my father's house, in the opposite direction from anywhere he'd have had any other reason to be that particular afternoon. Roger's presence at my father's bedside, offering solicitous comments about making sure everything's properly organized and not wanting Walter to have to worry about the details, carried a specific, professional smoothness that I found difficult to interpret charitably, even as I told myself, at the time, that I was likely being unfair to a man I simply didn't know well. He had a particular way of phrasing his concerns that always sounded, on the surface, entirely reasonable, offering to help coordinate paperwork or make sure nothing fell through the cracks during such a difficult time, language that, taken at face value, sounded like genuine helpfulness, but that, considered alongside the broader pattern, began to feel considerably more calculated the more I observed it. I mentioned my unease to my father directly, during one of his more lucid afternoons, and he listened carefully, in the specific, measured way he approached most things, before telling me, somewhat cryptically, that he'd already taken care of a few things and that I shouldn't worry too much about what Roger and my mother were or weren't doing during their visits. I didn't push further at the time, trusting, as I always had, in my father's own careful judgment about his own affairs. Looking back, I recognize that moment as the first, subtle hint that my father had already begun the quiet, deliberate work of protecting me from something he'd correctly anticipated, months before I fully understood what was actually happening around us. What I didn't fully understand at the time, though I would come to understand it in considerable detail later, was that my father had, roughly 3 months before his death, retained a new estate attorney entirely separate from the firm he'd used for decades, a specialist named Priya Anand who focused specifically on complex estate planning and asset protection for clients navigating exactly the kind of family dynamics my father was quietly worried about. I learned later, from Priya herself, that my father had approached her with a specific, direct concern, that his ex-wife and her new husband, sensing his declining health, had begun making comments during their visits that struck him as increasingly focused on his financial affairs rather than his well-being, comments about making sure things were fair and references to everything Diane sacrificed over the years that he found, in his own words to Priya, a little too pointed to be coincidental. Priya told me, once all of this eventually came to light, that my father had been remarkably composed and methodical about addressing this concern, treating it, in her words, like any other business problem he needed to solve carefully, rather than an emotional crisis. He'd asked her, specifically, to help him structure his estate in a way that would be difficult to successfully contest or manipulate, and to help him document, clearly and thoroughly, exactly why he was making the decisions he was making, in case anyone later tried to claim he hadn't been of sound mind or hadn't fully understood what he was doing. My father died on a Tuesday morning in March, peacefully, with me at his bedside, roughly 11 months after his initial diagnosis. The will reading took place about 3 weeks later, at Priya's office, with my mother, Roger, my father's younger brother Frank, and me all present. The will itself, as Priya read it aloud, was relatively straightforward on its face. The bulk of my father's liquid assets, totaling just over $2 million, were left to me directly, along with a smaller specific bequest to his brother Frank and a modest, though not insignificant, sum to a charitable foundation supporting cancer research, an organization he'd grown close to during his final months of treatment. My mother, notably, received nothing directly from the estate, a detail that struck me, in the moment, as entirely consistent with the fact that their divorce nearly a decade earlier had already involved a full division of marital assets, resolving any financial claims she might otherwise have had. I want to describe my mother's reaction to that reading as precisely as I can, because it mattered considerably for what followed. She didn't react with visible shock, exactly, but with a specific, tight-lipped composure that I recognized, even then, as the look of someone who'd been expecting a different outcome and was working hard to conceal her disappointment in the moment. Roger, beside her, said very little, though I noticed him glancing at his phone at one point during the reading, a small gesture that meant nothing to me at the time but that I'd come to understand, months later, as the moment he'd begun quietly researching his options. About 6 weeks after the will reading, my mother invited me to lunch, a gesture that struck me, at the time, as a genuine attempt to reconnect during a difficult period for both of us. What actually unfolded over that lunch, though, revealed itself gradually to be something considerably more calculated. She began by expressing, warmly enough, how proud she thought my father would have been of how I'd handled his final months, before pivoting, with a smoothness that felt, in retrospect, clearly rehearsed, into a discussion of what she described as some things worth thinking about together, as a family. She mentioned, specifically, that she and Roger had been talking with a financial advisor of their own, who'd raised the question of whether the full $2 million, left to me as a lump sum, might create significant, avoidable tax complications that could be mitigated through a family trust structure that Roger, with his financial background, could help set up and manage on my behalf. I remember feeling a specific, growing unease as she described this proposal, an unease I initially tried to talk myself out of, telling myself I was perhaps being unfairly suspicious of a mother genuinely trying to help. But something in the specific framing, the emphasis on Roger managing the structure, the vague, unspecified nature of exactly how this trust would work or what control I'd retain over my own inheritance, struck me as considerably less altruistic than the concern for my tax burden she was presenting it as. I told my mother, as diplomatically as I could manage, that I appreciated her concern but that I'd prefer to consult my own financial advisor and attorney before making any decisions about restructuring an inheritance my father had left directly to me. Her reaction to this response was subtle but unmistakable, a brief, tight flash of frustration crossing her face before she recovered into a more measured, faintly wounded tone, suggesting I was being unnecessarily distrustful of people who only wanted to help. I want to be honest that this exchange left me deeply unsettled in the days that followed, not just because of what had been proposed, but because of how quickly and smoothly my mother had pivoted from grief-adjacent warmth into a specific, financially oriented pitch, one that bore, I couldn't help but notice, Roger's particular fingerprints all over its structure and framing. I called Priya Anand the following week, both to ask her professional opinion about the trust structure my mother had proposed and to mention, somewhat hesitantly, the broader pattern of behavior I'd been noticing since my father's death. Priya listened carefully, and then told me something that shifted the entire trajectory of what came next, that she'd been expecting a version of this conversation, because my father, in his final weeks, had specifically anticipated it. Priya explained, during that call, that my father had grown increasingly concerned, in his final months, about exactly this kind of scenario, his ex-wife and her new husband attempting, after his death, to gain some form of control or influence over the inheritance he'd specifically structured to go directly and fully to me. He'd shared with Priya several specific incidents from his final months that had crystallized this concern, incidents I hadn't been fully aware of at the time. One incident, in particular, stood out. Roger had visited my father alone, without my mother present, roughly 2 months before his death, ostensibly to check in, and had, according to notes my father dictated to Priya immediately after that visit, spent much of the conversation asking pointed, specific questions about the structure of my father's assets, his relationship with his current estate attorney, and whether he'd considered modernizing his estate planning to account for what Roger described as changing family circumstances. My father, according to Priya, had found this conversation alarming enough that he'd contacted her the very same day, describing the visit in detail and asking her, explicitly, to help him build additional protections into his estate plan specifically designed to withstand exactly this kind of pressure, should it materialize after his death. Your father wasn't being paranoid, Priya told me. He was being remarkably clear-eyed about a pattern he'd noticed developing in real time, and he wanted to make sure you'd be protected from it even after he was no longer here to intervene himself. Priya walked me through, in that same conversation, the specific structure my father had put in place. Rather than simply leaving the $2 million to me through a standard bequest, which could theoretically be challenged or contested through probate litigation, he'd worked with Priya to place the majority of those assets into an irrevocable trust, with very specific, narrowly defined terms governing distribution, and with a trust protector clause naming Priya's firm, rather than any family member, as the entity responsible for overseeing the trust's administration. This structure, Priya explained, made it considerably more difficult for anyone to successfully argue, after the fact, that the assets should be redirected or restructured, since the terms had been established with extensive documentation of my father's clear mental competency at the time, verified through a formal cognitive evaluation he'd voluntarily undergone specifically to preempt exactly this kind of challenge. Your father did something I don't see often, Priya told me. Most people, even when they suspect family conflict might arise, don't take the additional step of documenting their own competency this thoroughly, or building in this many specific safeguards. He wanted to make absolutely certain that whatever happened after he was gone, you'd have both the legal structure and the evidence you'd need to protect what he'd left you. It was during this same conversation that Priya first mentioned something I hadn't known existed, a recorded video message my father had made in her office, roughly 6 weeks before his death, specifically addressing the possibility of exactly the kind of pressure I was now describing to her. He was very specific about the circumstances under which this should be shared with you, Priya explained. He didn't want it played immediately after his death, as a general goodbye message. He wanted it held, specifically, until either you requested it directly, or until a situation arose that matched several specific criteria he outlined: attempts by family members to alter, contest, or gain control over the trust structure he'd established. Based on what you've just described to me, I think we've reached that point. I remember sitting with my phone against my ear for a long moment after she said this, absorbing the fact that my father, in his final weeks, had anticipated this exact conversation with a clarity that felt almost eerie, and had left behind something specifically designed for this moment, rather than for the general, expected grief of losing him. Priya arranged for me to come into her office the following week to view the recording, explaining that she wanted to be present when I watched it, both to answer any questions it might raise and because my father had specifically requested her presence for this particular viewing. I want to describe, as carefully as I can, what it felt like watching that recording for the first time, sitting in Priya's office a week after that phone call, the blinds drawn against the afternoon light, a laptop open on the conference table between us. My father appeared on screen looking thinner and more tired than I remembered from even his final weeks, but unmistakably himself, the same steady, direct way of speaking, the same precise cadence he'd used my entire life when discussing anything he considered genuinely important. He began by addressing me directly, by name, in a tone that was warmer than his usual businesslike register but still carried his characteristic restraint. "Rachel," he said, "if you're watching this, it likely means your mother and Roger have done exactly what I suspected they might. I want you to know, first, that none of what follows comes from anger or bitterness towards your mother. Whatever went wrong between us, over the years, I've made my peace with. But I've watched, over these last several months, a pattern developing that I don't think either of them would characterize honestly, even to themselves, and I wanted to make sure you had what you needed to protect yourself from it." My father continued, over the following several minutes, laying out in careful, methodical detail exactly what he'd observed during his final months, the increased visits that seemed to correlate with his periods of fatigue, Roger's pointed questions about his estate structure, specific comments my mother had made about fairness and what she was owed after everything, comments my father noted, pointedly, contradicted the clean, mutually agreed division of assets that had already occurred during their divorce nearly a decade earlier. "I want to be honest with you about something else," he said, partway through the recording. "I don't think your mother is a bad person, fundamentally. I think Roger has a particular gift for making reasonable-sounding arguments for unreasonable requests, and I think your mother, in the specific vulnerability of watching an ex-husband die, has let herself be persuaded of things I don't believe she'd have considered on her own, years earlier. That doesn't make what may happen acceptable. It just means I want you to approach this, if it happens, with clarity rather than pure anger, because I think that clarity will serve you better in whatever comes next." He went on to explain, in specific terms, the trust structure he and Priya had built, the reasoning behind each protective measure, and his explicit wish that I understand, clearly, that the structure wasn't born from a lack of trust in me, but from a very deliberate, clear-eyed assessment of exactly the pressure he anticipated I might face. Toward the latter half of the recording, my father did something I hadn't fully anticipated. He referenced specific documents, dates, and incidents that Priya had, apparently at his instruction, already compiled into a physical file waiting for me, should this recording ever need to be played. "Priya has kept records of every interaction I've had with her regarding these concerns," he said, "along with dated notes from conversations with Roger and your mother that I found troubling enough to document at the time. I want you to have access to all of it, not because I expect you'll need to use it in some dramatic confrontation, but because I think you deserve to understand exactly what I observed, and why I made the choices I made, rather than simply trusting my judgment on faith." He also addressed, directly, the specific tax argument he anticipated Roger might raise. "If Roger has suggested restructuring your inheritance for tax reasons, I want you to know that Priya and I specifically designed this trust with tax efficiency already built in, reviewed by an independent tax attorney with no connection to our family. Any suggestion that a different structure would meaningfully improve your tax position isn't really about taxes. I think you'll understand, watching this, what I believe it's actually about. Once the recording finished, Priya opened a physical folder she'd had waiting on the table beside us, containing exactly what my father had described, dated notes documenting Roger's visit and the specific questions he'd asked, a summary of the cognitive competency evaluation my father had undergone, correspondence between my father and Priya spanning the final 3 months of his life, and a clear, detailed explanation of the trust's tax efficiency, prepared by the independent tax attorney my father had mentioned. I sat with that folder for a long time after Priya finished walking me through it, absorbing the full scope of what my father had quietly built, in his final weeks, specifically to protect me from a scenario he'd correctly anticipated, months before it actually began to unfold. I want to be clear about something, Priya told me, once we'd finished reviewing the documents. None of this is designed for aggressive confrontation. Your father was very deliberate about that. This is designed to be calmly, clearly presented, if and when it's needed, in a way that simply removes any ambiguity about what actually happened and why the trust is structured the way it is. He didn't want you going into any conversation with your mother and Roger from a position of anger. He wanted you going in from a position of complete, documented clarity. About 3 weeks after my lunch with my mother, Roger contacted me directly, requesting a meeting he described as an opportunity to walk through some financial planning ideas that could genuinely benefit everyone. I agreed to the meeting, now armed with a very different understanding of the pattern I was encountering, and with Priya's explicit encouragement that I bring her along, given the specific groundwork my father had laid for exactly this scenario. The meeting took place at Roger's own office, a choice I noted, at the time, as a subtle attempt to establish a kind of home field advantage. My mother was present as well, along with Roger's own attorney, a man named Curtis Bell, whose presence made clear that this meeting was considerably more formal, and more strategically prepared on their end, than the casual family conversation Roger had described when arranging it. I want to describe the specific tenor of that meeting carefully, because it revealed, more clearly than anything before it, exactly how coordinated my mother and Roger's approach had become. Curtis Bell opened by suggesting, in careful legal language, that there were legitimate questions about whether my father, in his final weeks, had been fully of sound mind when establishing the trust structure, given the aggressive nature of his illness and the medications he'd been taking, questions he suggested might warrant a formal probate challenge if not resolved through what he called a more collaborative restructuring. I let Curtis Bell finish his framing before responding, deliberately keeping my own tone as measured and unhurried as my father's had been in the recording I'd watched days earlier. I told them, plainly, that I was aware of the specific pattern of visits and conversations that had occurred during my father's final months, and that I had, in fact, extensive documentation addressing exactly the competency question Curtis had just raised. I watched my mother's expression shift as I said this, a flicker of genuine surprise, followed by a more guarded uncertainty, the look of someone realizing, in real time, that the conversation wasn't unfolding the way she and Roger had anticipated. Priya, seated beside me, then calmly outlined, in precise professional language, the cognitive competency evaluation my father had undergone specifically to preempt this kind of challenge, the independent tax review confirming the trust's efficiency, and the dated correspondence documenting my father's specific, contemporaneous concerns about the pattern of visits and questions he'd been receiving in his final months. Curtis Bell, to his credit, seemed to recalculate quickly, his earlier confidence visibly diminishing as Priya laid out the specific, thorough documentation my father had assembled. Roger, for his part, said considerably less than he had in his initial framing of the meeting, his earlier smooth confidence replaced by a noticeably more careful, clipped set of follow-up questions. It was toward the end of that meeting that I made the decision, one I'd discussed carefully with Priya beforehand, to mention the existence of my father's recorded message directly, without yet revealing its specific contents. I also want you to know, I said, keeping my voice as level as I could manage, that my father recorded a video message with Priya's office in his final weeks, specifically addressing exactly this kind of situation. I've watched it. I'm not going to share its full contents in this meeting, but I want to be clear that he anticipated this conversation, in some form, months before it happened, and he was very specific about what he observed and why he built the trust the way he did. I remember watching my mother's face during this specific moment more closely than almost any other point in the entire meeting. Something in her composure genuinely faltered, not dramatically, but in a way that suggested, for the first time, that she was beginning to reckon with the possibility that her ex-husband had seen through exactly what was unfolding, in real time, before either she or Roger had fully committed to it. Curtis Bell, sensing, I think, that the meeting's original framing had entirely collapsed, suggested a brief recess to allow everyone to reconsider positions, a suggestion Priya declined on my behalf, noting that we'd come prepared to discuss the trust as my father had established it, not to negotiate a restructuring built on premises that had just been substantially undermined. The meeting ended shortly afterward, without any formal resolution, though the specific tenor of the room had shifted entirely from where it had started. My mother said very little as we all gathered our things, though she caught my eye briefly on the way out, an expression I found difficult to fully interpret, something between embarrassment and a kind of reluctant, dawning recognition. Roger, notably, avoided eye contact entirely, gathering his materials with a brisk efficiency that struck me, in the moment, as an attempt to exit the situation as quickly as possible, before its full implications could be discussed any further in front of his own attorney. In the days following that meeting, I heard nothing directly from my mother or Roger, a silence that felt, after weeks of escalating pressure, both strange and cautiously welcome. Priya advised me to continue documenting any further contact carefully, noting that formal probate challenges, if my mother and Roger ultimately decided to pursue one despite the meeting's outcome, would need to be filed within a specific window, and that the absence of immediate contact didn't necessarily mean the matter was fully resolved. About 2 weeks later, my mother called me directly, without Roger or any attorneys present, asking whether we could talk, just the two of us. I agreed, cautiously, and we met at a coffee shop rather than either of our homes or offices, a neutral setting that felt, to both of us, more appropriate for the kind of conversation we were about to have. My mother arrived looking noticeably different than she had at either of our previous meetings, less composed, in a way that struck me as more genuine than the careful, polished presentation she'd maintained throughout the earlier stages of this conflict. She apologized, almost immediately, for the meeting at Roger's office, describing it as something she'd agreed to more out of pressure from Roger than from any independent conviction of her own that she was entitled to a share of my father's estate. "I want to be honest with you," she said. "Roger's been dealing with some financial difficulties of his own that I didn't fully understand the extent of until recently. I think he saw your father's death as an opportunity to address some of that, and I let myself be persuaded that framing it as fairness, rather than what it actually was, would make it easier for both of us to live with." I asked her, directly, whether she'd known about the specific pattern of visits and questions my father had documented in his final months, the timing coinciding with his fatigue, Roger's pointed conversation about restructuring the estate. She admitted, with visible discomfort, that she'd been present for or aware of most of what my father had described, and that she'd told herself, at the time, that it was simply practical planning rather than anything more calculated. Toward the end of that conversation, my mother asked, hesitantly, whether I'd be willing to let her watch my father's recorded message, explaining that she thought she needed to hear, directly from him, exactly what he'd observed and how he'd interpreted it, rather than continuing to piece it together secondhand through my own account of the meeting. I told her I'd think about it, genuinely uncertain, in the moment, whether sharing that recording with her would serve any real purpose beyond causing her additional pain, or whether it might, instead, provide the kind of direct clarity that could actually help her reckon honestly with what had happened. I discussed the question with Priya afterward, who reminded me that my father had left the decision about how and with whom to share the recording entirely in my hands, without specific restrictions beyond the core condition that had already been met. I ultimately decided to share it with her, a decision I made partly out of a genuine, if complicated, remaining love for my mother, and partly because I thought my father's own words, delivered directly and without my interpretation shaping them, might accomplish something a confrontation between the two of us never fully could. I arranged for my mother to view the recording at Priya's office, with Priya present, the same setting in which I'd first watched it myself. I chose not to be in the room for her viewing, wanting her to have the same unmediated space with my father's words that I'd had, without my own presence shaping her reaction to it. Priya told me afterward that my mother had cried through much of the recording, particularly during the section where my father addressed her directly, acknowledging that whatever had gone wrong in their marriage, he didn't consider her fundamentally dishonest, but rather someone who'd let herself be persuaded, in a moment of genuine vulnerability, towards something she wouldn't have considered on her own terms, years earlier. My mother called me later that same evening, her voice noticeably different than it had been in any of our previous conversations throughout this entire ordeal. "He knew me better than I think I knew myself, in this," she said. "I don't have a good excuse for what happened. I let Roger's version of events become my own, because it was easier than sitting with what I actually believed, deep down, was true." My mother, in the weeks that followed, made the decision to formally withdraw from any further involvement in a probate challenge, informing Curtis Bell directly that she wouldn't be participating in any further action against the trust my father had established. This decision, predictably, created significant tension in her marriage to Roger, tension that, over the following months, contributed to a broader unraveling I wasn't directly involved in but heard about through occasional, brief updates from my mother. Roger, for his part, attempted to pursue a probate challenge independently for a brief period, though without my mother's active participation and cooperation. His legal standing to contest a trust established by a man he had no direct familial relationship with proved considerably weaker than Curtis Bell had originally suggested. Priya informed me, several months later, that the challenge had been formally withdrawn, likely, she speculated, once Roger's own attorney had more fully assessed the documented weakness of his position without my mother's continued support. My mother and Roger separated roughly 8 months after that final coffee shop conversation, a development she relayed to me with a mixture of sadness and what I understood to be a kind of clear-eyed relief, having, by that point, more fully reckoned with the specific role his influence had played in a decision she now viewed with genuine regret. I want to be honest that my relationship with my mother, in the time since all of this unfolded, remains complicated, marked by a kind of careful, still rebuilding trust rather than any simple, complete restoration of what existed before. We speak regularly now, and she's made a consistent, sustained effort to acknowledge, directly and without deflection, the specific harm caused by her participation in Roger's plan, an acknowledgement I've come to appreciate, even as I remain, understandably, more guarded with her than I once was. The trust itself remains intact, exactly as my father structured it, providing for my financial security in precisely the way he'd intended, protected by the specific, methodical foresight he brought to bear during the final months of his life, when he might reasonably have been forgiven for focusing on almost anything other than a legal structure designed to protect me from people he still, in some complicated way, cared about. People who hear this story sometimes assume my father must have been an unusually suspicious or distrustful man, someone who anticipated betrayal reflexively rather than as a genuine, specific response to a pattern he was actually observing in real time. I don't think that's accurate. My father was, by nature, a careful and precise person, but not a cynical one. What he did in his final months wasn't born from generalized distrust of my mother or Roger. It was born from paying close, specific attention to a pattern developing in front of him, and taking it seriously enough to act on it methodically, rather than dismissing his own observations out of a desire to avoid an uncomfortable confrontation during an already difficult time. What I learned, watching this entire situation unfold, is that some of the most meaningful protection a person can offer the people they love doesn't come from dramatic, in-the-moment intervention, but from quiet, careful preparation, done well in advance, specifically designed to hold up under exactly the kind of pressure that seems unlikely until, suddenly, it isn't. I don't think my mother set out, at the start of my father's illness, to participate in something she'd eventually come to regard with genuine shame. I think, like a lot of people navigating grief and vulnerability at the same time, she allowed someone else's confident, persistent framing to gradually replace her own better judgment, a pattern that only fully revealed itself once someone else's careful documentation made it impossible to keep looking away from. I still think about my father often, not primarily in terms of the money he left me, though I remain deeply grateful for the security that inheritance has provided, but in terms of the specific, quiet care he took, in his final weeks, to protect me from something he couldn't have been entirely certain would happen, but chose to prepare for anyway, methodically and without drama, because he loved me enough to do the hard, unglamorous work of anticipating a problem rather than simply hoping it wouldn't materialize. I've since learned to pay closer attention, in my own life, to the kind of quiet, gradual pressure that can reshape someone's judgment over time, the way it apparently reshaped my mother's, without her fully recognizing it happening until someone else's careful documentation made the pattern impossible to ignore. And I've learned that sometimes the clearest, most powerful message someone can leave you isn't really about what they say directly. It's about the quiet, deliberate work they did long before you ever needed it, specifically so you'd have exactly what you needed when the moment finally came. If you've ever discovered that someone who loved you had quietly protected you from something before you even knew to worry about it, I'd love to hear how it unfolded. Let me know in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one coming every week.